This is Damon Fordham, historian, author, and adjunct professor of history at the Citadel and Charleston Southern University in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, I collect stories in the same way that other people like to collect stamps. And very recently, I was in my birthplace of Spartanburg, South Carolina, to attend a funeral. And during the time I was in town, I stopped by the Kennedy Library over on North Church Street, and I went to one of my favorite places, the Kennedy Room in the library, where they have this interesting archive of rare books and old newspaper clippings of the little-known facts about that city and county's history. Stuff that you don't find everywhere else, which is the kind of history that I enjoy. And one of the things that I learned, while I was looking through this stuff, I found a clipping from a newspaper called Niles Weekly Register. And it was dated on May the 14th, 1831, published in Baltimore, Maryland. And it told about an interesting story of a slave uprising in Spartanburg, South Carolina, that took place about April the 15th, 1831. 1831 was also the year that Spartanburg became incorporated as a town, I might add. But anyway, the story goes as follows. Horrid outrage from the North Carolina Spectator. A gentleman from the Spartanburg District, South Carolina, has stated to us the following particulars of one of the most wanton outrages we have ever heard. Mr. Woodruff, a very respectable and wealthy gentleman, was about to pay a visit to his father-in-law, Mr. Dean, who was sick, and he was met a short distance from Mr. Dean's by 5 Negro men belonging to Mr. Dean. Now, keep in mind, folks, this is 1831. They're writing this. Anyway, 4 of them were on one side of the road busily engaging him in conversation, while a 5th crept up on the opposite side and with a heavy club felled him to the ground, where they killed him. They placed his lifeless body on the horse, placing the feet in the stirrups, and directed the horse towards Mr. Dean's, where 3 of the murderers went back to Mr. Dean's and 2 fled to the woods. The Negroes had scarcely reached home when the horse of Mr. Woodruff came, with the shoe of its owner still hanging in the stirrup. The murderers, with hypocritical alarm, exclaimed that their master Woodruff had fallen off the horse and gotten killed. The horse was traced back, and the inanimate body of Mr. Woodruff was found. The search was continued still further until they came to the spot where he had been murdered, where the deadly club was found and marks of blood and violence on the ground, together with the prints of the Negroes' feet. Suspicion immediately fell on the Negroes belonging to Mr. Dean, and 3 of them were taken and tried, and we are informed 2 of them hung on Friday the 15th instant, and the 3rd retained to testify against the 2 others when they shall be apprehended. The cause we have heard for the perpetration of this atrocious deed was that Mr. Dean, being sick, and as his son-in-law, would become heir in the case of his demise, and the Negroes, from some cause not wishing to fall into the hands of Mr. Woodruff, took the measures above related to prevent such an event. Wow. Interesting stuff. Several things to consider. There is Mr. Dean mentioned here. There's a Dean Street in Spartanburg, South Carolina, that's in a large part of the black community. And as a matter of fact, some of my own relatives and ancestors once lived on Dean Street, and there was a Kohl's grocery store that was owned by a black man over on Dean Street once upon a time, as well as an AME Zion church. And at the end of the street, there was a black neighborhood called Gas Bottom next to the petroleum fields, which today you have a car dealership located. Now, there's also a Woodruff, South Carolina, in Spartanburg County, which I assume might be named after this Mr. Woodruff. But here are the other things to consider about this. We tend to think that there were very few slave rebellions. Those of us who know about these things know about the the Denmark Vesey Rebellion in Charleston, or the Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia, and perhaps if you saw the movie Amistad, the Amistad Rebellion. But very few people know that there were way more slave rebellions than that. You see, Herbert Aptheker wrote a book called American Negro Slave Revolts that talks about many of these incidences that were not recorded well at the time, because they did not want to inspire fear in the white population, and they did not want to encourage the black population to do these type of things. Additionally, now remember, this took place in 1831, which in about March or April of that year. And in August of 1831, you had the Nat Turner Rebellion up in Southampton County, Virginia, in which some 50 whites were killed by revolting enslaved people led by Nat Turner, an enslaved man who read the Bible and was encouraged by the book of Revelations to mete out vengeance. And to those who would say, well, these were pretty bloody actions, well, you have to consider, if you were enslaved, what would you do? Think about that. You know, a lot of wars have been fought over this type of thing, so this is not unusual. Slave revolts have happened in every place where slavery has existed throughout humankind. And another thing to consider is that there is such a thing as hidden history. Many things did not make the history books, but if you dig deep enough, you'll find that there are many more stories of this kind, as well as many others, and hopefully this will encourage you to seek them out. This is Damon Fordham talking about the little-known event called the Spartanburg Slave Rebellion of 1831.